Hey y'all, time to talk about Moons of Jupiter, which I hope you enjoyed. I think it and Progress of Love are one that I kind of go back and forth with, signing first, kind of put it in the middle here. I think it's a great example of what a Munro story can do, as opposed to a typical story, maybe about the same general subject matter. This is a story about a dealing with the loss of a parent. It's easy to miss too the fact that this is a story where the father dies, and it's relegated to maybe a line and a clue buried sort of in the text, because this isn't a book like I said. Alice Munro isn't an author just trying to wrench emotion out of you. She's trying to help us understand these characters, understand things they don't know about themselves. A theme of this story, very similar to some of the themes we've already seen, these relationships between parents and children, these assumptions we have that change, that shift over time with added perspective. We've seen that to some extent in every story we've looked at. Even with Fitz, there's discussion about the sons. I think but that's important to note. Really get a good look at Munro's use of structure in aid of character. Though it may not always seem like it, what she's doing with structure is always serves the purpose of the engine of the story. And the engine of the story is really character. And that can usually be said 99% of the time. That's the engine of every story, is that exploration of character and trying to find out something new about the human experience. And we certainly see it here. If we were in a seated class, as the story, I do like to ask a few rhetorical questions right off the bat. And maybe I can ask that and you can pause the lecture or whatever, but really interested in what you think about how she handles the structure, especially early on in the story. And really, with this lecture, I really want to focus on the first half, the first third of the story, because it's a classic example of Munro giving a character sort of a bigger epiphany early on, so she's better equipped to deal with what happens later on in the story. Anyway, we open up with the literal situation where the narrator finds her father in the hospital, in the heart wing. Of course, this is a story about matters of the heart to an extent. Oh, my cat just tried to jump up and did a ninja move. And it's a story about matters of the heart, so it's the heart that he's dealing with. So we see the father then characterized in action and words, just how he reacts to being in this room. He's worried that he might get charged extra, sort of a nice, sort of a typical characterization strategy there for the father. So he's worried about money, even though he's in sort of a dire situation, possibly with his heart. He had wires taped to his chest. A small screen hung over his head. On the screen, a bright, jagged line was continually being written. The writing was accompanied by a nervous, electronic beeping. The behavior of his heart was on display. The EKG. I tried to ignore it. It seemed to me that paying such close attention, in fact, dramatizing what ought to be most a secret activity, was asking for trouble. Anything exposed in that way was apt to flare up and go crazy. So this is sort of a screenplay trick, actually. It's giving us sort of the theme of the story, theme of the movie. Usually comes across in some way. Somebody says it within the first 5 minutes of a movie. Here, we literally get the theme, the conflict, right there. And it's in the form of this heart monitor, which scares her to look at too closely because it feels like she's seeing something she shouldn't. Yet this is a story about her need to look closer, her need to pay attention to what she's already taken for granted. So character is the key here, but this use of the EKG machine serves that purpose. And it's just a great example of like seeing, like, maybe I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that too close. Sometimes I use the example, I may have used this in class before, of driving with the brights on, or if it's dark outside. Rarely drive when it's dark outside. I mean, fuck, nobody drives anywhere now anyway. Can't go anywhere. But the idea that, like, if we're driving, like, maybe through the woods, or like on an old highway and it's dark, and my wife's like, why don't you put the brights on? And my rationalization is, I don't want to see any shit I don't have to see. And I just saw my new puppy appear over my shoulder. But but the point of the story is, like, she's going to need the look story. My father did not seem to mind. He said they had on tranquilizers, the happy pills. He did not. He seemed calm and optimistic. However, the night before it had been a different story. So here we get this really strange shift. We open up with her finding her father in the heart ward. Then we, within a page, go back in time, not even after a white space, but within the text here. And we find out that the night before, she brought him to the hospital, he'd been nervous. He'd been pale. He'd been pale about it. And then she'd talked to a doctor. How long? It says he needs. It basically finds out that he needs immediate surgery. This is the night before. It said, how long would he have to be in bed? How long? Months. How long would he live? That's what I meant too. So basically saying, you're gonna have this surgery, you're gonna die. Went to see my father. Then she basically tells him anything, exaggerated, hopeful, the doctor had said. I was tired from the drive all the way back to get him back to Toronto since noon, worried about getting my rented car back in time. She was also irritated by a magazine in the waiting room. Now, this seems like a throwaway detail that just lets us know what she does. We find out she's a writer, and she'd been reading a magazine article about another writer who was younger and a little bit more successful and more talented. So she hadn't seen it. And then she realizes that as she's reading it, her father would have seen it. And she can hear him saying, okay, hey, enough, I need to do this, okay? All right? I was reading, my father, he would have said something about how he hadn't read anything about her in McLean's. So this tells us a few things. It shows that there's this sort of arm's length distance the father keeps her from praise a little bit. It also shows that he reads Maclean's, which is basically like the Canadian version of the New Yorker or the Atlantic, so the father's well-read. And we see this sort of relationship get characterized here with just this small detail, and this stuff's going to come back up later. So this is on the back of her mind too. The fact that, like, her dad, and we see more of it, like, would sort of be teasing her a little bit about, hey, this writer's pretty successful. Why didn't you get there in Maclean's? Not surprised by the doctor's news. I was prepared to hear something. So she's sort of recognizing her role as the strong daughter here, taking care of this, and otherwise it's plenty. So we've introduced the literal situation. The next day, he was himself again. So this gets us back to the beginning. All right, and this is where I'm going to ask the question. Hold on one second here. All right, hey, I need the cat out of here. Okay, I can't concentrate there. Out. Now. All right. So, my question to you would be, why start the story this way? So we start sort of in the middle of this happening. Like, she's found the father the day after that he'd gone to the hospital. Why not simply start the story when she gets the call from him telling her that he needs to go to the hospital? Why start it here? So give yourself a chance to answer that question, because just in terms of like simplicity, as someone who teaches creative writing or even just writing in general, the simplest way to tell a story is point A to point B. So why start here, move back, and then get right back to where you started by page 3. The next day he was himself again. Okay. For one, it sets up, uh, it introduces us in one way to like the nuts and the bolts of how Munro works. So there's that. We got to kind of push that one aside, but it is something. She sets up her story in a way that helps you understand how the rest of the story is going to be. She, like we have already talked about, she works in rooms. She works as a house. So that's one thing. It also, it said, hold on a second, with a note here. Yes. It sets up her as someone who's analytical, someone who sort of, does something and thinks about it, kind of goes back, and this is sort of sets up her character. Thirdly, and most importantly, it sets up the story thematically. This is a story about reevaluation, reassessment, having a situation, taking another look at it, a deeper, more closer look at it, and finding out something you may have missed the first time around. So she's setting this up for her to be able to do that. So we get to the next day, which is where the story starts. He's feeling good again. Why is he feeling good again? Because an older doctor told him that the doctor last night may have been a bit knife happy. And it turns out the doctor last night was younger, so he gets some generational stuff going on there. He says he's got a defective valve, but maybe we don't need to rush this. Then we get this sort of backstory on her father's childhood. Just some great imagery there. Her seeing her father as a child, her imagining him now, how frail he seems now, and how hard that's for her to imagine. We get a little bit of you probably make some comparisons here to the chapter with or the story with Marietta, and sort of seeing Marietta, as several of you mentioned, just beautifully in the the forum, how Marietta and the mother are really separated, the same people, the same person, but separated as characters, because this little girl was sort of lost. Anyway, this is what I expected of him, so forth. When I told people about my father, stressed his independence, his self-sufficiency. He worked in a factory, he worked in a garden, he read history books. You could tell about the Roman emperors, Balkan Wars. He never made a fuss. This is this great look at her dad. Her dad's a great character too. Like, maybe a little more intellectual than you'd figure, but also sort of sturdy and so forth. Now we go to the next section, and we get Judith. Judith, my younger daughter, had come to meet me at Toronto at the airport 2 days before. So once again, we're going back in time. We've already set this up. Nuts and bolts of the story. Here's a second question I would ask. Why now introduce her daughter, and then, and to another extent, her older daughter, who we only see through sort of flashback, and she's talked about, to this story? This is a story about a woman coming to grips with her father's mortality, her father dying. We got the setup. It's in a hospital. It's basically, the conflict is, will he or will he not get the surgery? Will the surgery work, and so forth. Cut it. You don't need this stuff with daughters. It adds too much. Like you've added a room onto the house you don't need. Contraire. It's exactly what she needs. It's exactly the trigger that helps her understand her dad better. And Munro's got this great way of not making it contingent, like plot-wise. Like, we need this thematically. We need to see the daughter, her relationship with her daughters, and especially that one moment when she thinks maybe the older daughter, when she was very young, had leukemia. We need to see that. She needs to see that. She needs to sort of go back to that to be able to understand her dad better, even though these two threads never really intersect with the plot. So we need those stories. Hey, sweetie. Hey, how's your run go? I'm on lecture right now, so you may want to stay out of the frame.
Hi.
That's my wife. She's running right now. She's not running right now. She's stopping right now. Anyway, get to Judith day before, or 2 days before, when she'd met her mom. She brought the boy she was living with. Great use of perspective here. This is obviously a first-person point of view story, so the fact that she calls this, grown up, basically, that her daughter is living with a boy, shows this sense of sort of judgment she's casting. And again, this is before the hospital. This is 2 days before any of this happened. So they're driving to Mexico, so she's staying at their house, or their apartment while she's gone. Where's Nicola? I said, thinking once of an accident or overdose. I love that. And you can tell it in her voice too. Again, we have another situation where the younger daughter, the younger sibling, seems to be the more mature one in certain ways. And of course, we find out why later. But the mother seems to clearly think of Nicola as the baby, the one to be worried about, the one to take care of, even though she hasn't seen her for a very long time. I love that. That saying. Maybe you guys are in that period now, or maybe every time you call your parents, one of them or both of them, the first thing they say when you call is, "What's wrong?" That seems to be her situation with Nicola here. And then we get this sort of complicated situation with her and Nicole. If she'd been there, I probably would have said something wrong. And then Judith is pissed because the first thing the mom asked is about Nicola. We'll get your bag. Don is like trying to stay out of it. Is she all right? I'm sure she is. You wouldn't look like that if I wasn't the one. If I was the one who wasn't here, of course I would. No, you wouldn't. Nicola's the baby of the family. You know, even though she's 4 years older than I am. Judith didn't know where Nicola was exactly. She'd been telephoning. I told her you'd worry, but don't. She's all right, believe me. Don's presence made me uncomfortable, but the fact that he's there makes her think more deeply about the situation, which in turn gives us the setup for this sort of epiphany that's coming fairly early in the story. I did not like him to hear these things. I thought of conversations they must have had, Don and Judith, or Don and Judith and Nicola, for Nicola and Judith were sometimes on good terms, or Don and Judith and Nicola and others whose names I did not even know. They would talk about me. Judith and Nicola comparing notes, relating anecdotes, analyzing, regretting, blaming, forgiving. I wish I'd had a boy or a girl or 2 boys. They wouldn't have done that. Boys couldn't possibly know so much about you. That's a really funny line. I always like it, like as a man, like you listen to that line, you're like, yeah, boys wouldn't do that until she gets to that last part. It's like, because they're too stupid to. And then she goes back. This triggers, I did the same thing at that age. But here's the deal. She's done that same thing the entire story. And she does the same thing the entire story. Analyzing, regretting, blaming, forgiving. It's this constant cycle. She did it. And she realizes when she was their age that she thought the same thing about her dad. And it's interesting. It's like this. She's in this sort of spot now that you get, and I'm not quite there yet, thankfully, but I'm getting closer than I used to be. There's this point where you realize, and you realize this fairly young, not too young, but there's a point where you become maybe the age you're at now, and you realize just how much of a life your parents had before you and without you. Like they had friends, they had dreams, they had these things, and that's sort of something to come to terms with and understand. They're not just there, weren't made just to create you. And then you get to the point though eventually where then like your kids will be that same way. And she sort of reached this point where she's sort of right there in the middle. But anyway, she remembers talking with her friends in the college cafeteria late at night over coffee. And she realized when she was the age Nicola is now, I had Nicola herself. I was drinking coffee on a rainy afternoon with one of my friends. We talked about our parents, our childhoods, though for some time we kept clear of our marriages. Now, it's a great touch there. We talked about our parents, our childhood. So all this stuff they talk about to pass the time, to feel better about themselves, but they refuse to talk about their own problems, much like the Wheelers and the Campbells in that living room early on in Revolutionary Road, just finding things to talk about. How thoroughly, I love this, Pat, this may be my favorite line in the story, how thoroughly we dealt with our fathers and mothers, deplored their marriages, their mistaken ambitions or fear of ambition, how competently we filed them away, defined them beyond any possibility of change. What presumption. And that's sort of like that thing we talked about with Miles City, Montana, where in our heads, the parents in their heads sort of create roles for their children. And it becomes harder to let them out of those roles. Like you always see them as this particular thing or type or character. And the same thing can be done with parents. And she's realizing this now, this assumption that they are who they are, and firm, and they don't change. The only way they can change is if we sort of dictate that they change by how we see them, instead of actually realizing that they're, a constituted person, and in their own form, and they have all these other things going on. It's really fascinating to think about. She sees Don walking ahead. What right did he have to hear about me, to know things I myself had probably forgotten? I decided that his beard and hairstyle were affected. I love that. Once, and then we get a for instance, it's just perfect. Once when my children were little, my father said to me, those years you were growing up, well, that's all just kind of a blur to me. I can't sort out one year from another. I was offended. I remembered each separate year with pain and clarity. I could have told how old I was when I went to look at the evening dresses at the windows of Bimbo's ladies wear for a week through winter, a new dress, spotlit, made me a cold worshiper on the slushy sidewalk. This comes back later. It's something she does when she's nervous. And it's a childhood trick she picked up. She liked to window shop. It's a great touch. It's wonderful how it gets used later, but she remembers how old she was. I could have told how old I was when I forged my mother's signature on a bad report card, when I had measles, when we papered the front room. But the years where Judith and Nicola, her kids, were little, when I lived with her father, yeah, blur's the right word for it. Now she's realizing something her father had told her that she'd been offended about was true, that it does sort of go by in a blur. I guess, speaking from personal experience, was a little bit different with my daughter than it was my boys, because my boys were twins. But yeah, those first 6 months, blur is certainly the right word for it. Now, my wife and I are very lucky in the fact that we both have jobs where we're able to see them quite a bit. So I know I remember more things maybe than some people get to. But I know that my boys, they live the whole life. They do the whole thing the whole time. So they're gonna have very specific memories about being that age that I have no clue about. Let's see. Yes, it was a blur. I remember hanging out diapers, folding diapers. I can recall the kitchen counter of 2 houses with a clothes basket set. I remember the television, but couldn't tell the years apart. So these different years, and this is her and her husband. They'd sort of become at 20, sort of like a cartoon couple, more middle-aged in our 20s than we would be in middle age. And here sneaks up on us, but it's the big epiphany of the story, and it guides her later on when she's dealing with her dad. Those bumbling years are the years our children will remember all their lives. Corners of the yards I never visited will stay in their head. That passage, corners of the yards I never visited, will stay in their heads. It's so wonderful, and it's nice too, considering how she uses houses as sort of a metaphor to tell her stories. The fact that we're now talking about a yard. It's just fantastic. So they leave, but now she's prepared sort of psychologically, character-wise, to deal with what she's going to deal with the rest of the story. The father calls, and this takes us back to the beginning of the story. So we sort of, again, now you may start to notice that even more than any of the other Munro stories, even though it's sort of going into different rooms, we do see a pattern in this story, and it's circular. It's rotational. And you look at the title, you're like, moons. They've revolve around the planet, allegedly. No, it's true. It controls the tides. But so we get this sort of pattern. Now the moons of Jupiter is sort of a trivial thing that comes up later in a very nice way, but that circular pattern we certainly see here. Anyway, so then the father, so again we go back and forth. The fourth day, father says he's going to have the surgery. Looks like I might as well have. When are they going to do it? Day after tomorrow. She goes and she talks to a nurse about it, which nurses just love. When you jump in there and demand like what's going on. So she gets back into the room, And when he gets there, he's reciting poetry. He's thinking about a poem, Shoreless Seas. And he's contemplating now because he's going to have this surgery, and it could mean the end. It actually does end up meaning the end. He doesn't come out of the surgery. And he starts talking about how, anything in any type of situation like this, if you can't explain it, there's a great temptation to believe in, she's like, the soul? It's like, maybe you can call it that, First came out of the room, there's a pile of paper by the bed. It's like, and he starts talking about these National Enquirer type stuff. Talking about people with death experiences where they died and they came back. And he starts wondering, and this is as close to sort of a talk about death as you're going to get. And it sort of comes at arm's length as they do. Because anyway, if you're going to believe that, you got to believe everything else in those papers, and they say Elvis is alive and all this stuff. So anyway, he asks, the daughter asks, do you want me to phone Peggy? Peggy's her sister. I guess we ought to tell him, but tell him not to get alarmed. All right. No, wait a minute. And this is the father. Sam is supposed to be going to a conference at the end of the week. Peggy's planning to go. I don't want them changing their plans. What was the conference? Amsterdam, he said proudly. Now, this is about his son-in-law, who's married to the narrator's sister. He did take pride in Sam. He kept track of his books and articles. He would pick one up and say, look at that, will you? And I can't understand a word of it in a marveling voice. Professor Sam and the three little Sams. This is what he called his grandsons. And the dogs who have been obedient school. And Peggy. So he sort of makes these jokes. He's very, very proud of his son-in-law. He talks about how the dogs and even his daughter, he's joking, like, go to obedience school. And then, but if I would have said, do you suppose she'd been in obedience school too? He wouldn't play the game any further. So basically the father, will tease, but it's only him. He doesn't let anybody else take it too far. And she imagines, it's like, probably whenever he's with Sam and Peggy, if they're joking about me, he would put his hand up as well. And she's realizing here that the reason he does this is because he doesn't want it to seem like he's bragging. He doesn't, but he's very, very proud of her. And then buried in this story, almost in a parenthetical, but not at the very end of that little passage, I found later in the house, this is after the story, this is the first clue that he doesn't make it through the surgery. I found later in the house things of mine he had kept, a few magazines, clippings, things I had never bothered about. So this entire time she thinks that she doesn't have his approval and all this stuff, doesn't think he does. He shows it differently. He doesn't want to look like he's bragging or whatnot. Now that scene, in a lesser author, the author would save that scene for the very end, and the tears haven't come yet, and then finally she goes through the house, going through his stuff after he's died, and she finds all these articles and pictures of her and stories about her that he saved because she was proud. Tears, John Mayer song or something in the background, and everybody's walks out of the theater weeping. Munro isn't concerned with that. I love how she buries that story here, because this isn't about, manipulating emotion out of you. It's really about understanding, what's up here. Anyway, have you heard from Judith? Not yet. Well, pretty soon. Are they going to sleep in the van? He's teasing here. He even asked if they're going to put a board in the middle of the van. She keeps finding herself looking at the heart line. Kind of bothering him. He's sort of exposed there. Anyway, the next afternoon, she doesn't go to the hospital. His father's having more tests done. So she finds herself wandering around. She goes to the dress shops, tries on clothes. It connects us back to the beginning or to that memory she had when she was young of doing this in times of stress. And finally, she decides to go to the museum. Which is great in a time of sort of uncertainty. You head to this place full of mystery and awe. And then we remember another time in Vancouver. And Nicola was in kindergarten, Judith was a baby. Nicole had been to the doctor for a cold, and the doctor found something troubling about the white blood cells. And so they're thinking childhood cancer. And for a few days, they don't know. And during that time, what triggers this memory is the fact that she took Nicola home, babysitter stayed, she goes out and bought a dress. Seems like a strange thing to do in a moment like that. You find out your child might have cancer. You're not going to know for a few days. But it's the canned peaches and pound cake. It's the letters. It's the diary. They carry the things they carried. It's a coping mechanism. Here's another one though, and this one cuts even deeper. I also remember going home from St. Paul's Hospital with Nicole on my knee after she'd found out that maybe she has cancer. They would go over the bridge. I realized I was touching her with a difference, though I did not think it could be detected. There was care, not withdrawal exactly, but care not to feel anything much. I saw how the forms of love might be maintained with a condemned person, but with the love in fact measured and disciplined because you have to survive. What she's talking about here isn't that far off removed from what we talked about in the things they carried with how the men coped with the fact that they're so close to death. Now, again, not saying it's always this way or never this, blah, blah, blah. But in that case, it tended to be, we're dealing with sort of men dealing with not being able to bring up these fears in a way. And that's how they sort of protected themselves. Here we see another type of protection. And to me, it's even more startling and revelatory, where you see that she is protecting herself from the devastation that's naturally going to come if, in fact, Nicola does have cancer and if, in fact, she loses her. It's not that she cares any less about her. It's not that the child would even know any different, but she's preparing herself in a way that her touch is a little bit different. The way she's holding her child is a little bit different. Because if she went all in and then lost her, she feels like she might die herself. Just fantastic. You can see how then this grows into sort of the relationship they have now. Now she's the mother who's constantly worried about her, and to the point of annoyance. And, that's how they get to where they are. Anyway, she doesn't have cancer. Once again, we have a story in Munro where it's sort of a what if, but that what if, is fascinating. I mean, there are stories in Munro where it's not just what if. There are stories where things happen. Will Fitz is a good example, although that wasn't to the main characters. But there's plenty of stories where stuff happens. But nonetheless, I'm fascinated that she can do more with something that didn't happen than most people can with stories about kids with cancer. And that's not a knock on John Green. Is that his name? I think it is. Anyway, okay, so she I could not think of anything in the museum I really want to see, so she goes to the planetarium. And she sits there, and there's like these kids in there as well, like a field trip. And the dark ceiling fills with stars all at once. It's just boom, boom, boom. The universe is around her. I love that we've gone from just the confines of a house to the hospital to now exploration of the universe. And we get these stunning facts, repetitions. And then we see the solar system spin away. We see Jupiter. The mass of Jupiter, 2.5 times that of all the other planets put together. The Great Red Spot, 13 moons past Jupiter. Glance at the electric orbit of Pluto, the icy rings of Saturn. This is not what they used to tell us, that it all rotated once. So there used to be this thing, moonless Mercury, rotating 3 times while circling the sun twice. An odd arrangement, not as satisfying as what they used to tell us, that it rotated once as it circled the sun. And so, there's just that they used to think, astronomers used to think that Mercury only circled, only rotated once as it circled the sun. So there was like half of Mercury that sort of stayed in darkness the entire time. Turned out to be that wasn't true. Now, this ties into that reevaluation and also ties into what's going on with her father. Why did they give out such confident information only to announce later that it was quite wrong? Now, I can't help but notice the irony here of Pluto being in this story. And then at some point, I believe, I've been corrected on this, so I want to get this right. But at some point, they said Pluto's not a planet anymore, right? But now I think it's a planet again. or it's like a dwarf planet or something. So yeah, and yeah, confidently these things get said, and then like, no, 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 we were wrong, we were wrong. And I'm a big science guy, but I think too often people just like think there's like science, that's it. Like, no, science, because of science, things are constantly, so we're sort of learning more. It's not like you say science and it's like a mic drop. Like, scientists don't drop their mics. And even with this stuff that we're going through now, I mean, just in the past month, we've heard things that were very, very clear and confident, and those things, and I'm not talking about politics or anything like that, but I'm just saying from scientists themselves, just because they're finding out new things about this virus that we're dealing with, and then all of a sudden it's something else. I'm still waiting for them to say it's cool to wear the entire ninja outfit, and then my dream will finally be realized. Why do they give out such confident information? Only announced later was quite wrong. Finally, the picture, already familiar from the magazine, the red soil of Mars, the blooming pink skies. She sits with the kids for a while and then leaves. I went to the show at the planetarium, I said to my father. It was very exciting about the solar system. I thought about what a silly word I'd use. Exciting. Like a slightly phony temple. She adds the phrase slightly phony temple as if to protect herself from herself. Like she said she feels silly for saying exciting in front of her dad, who's already talking. I remember when they found Pluto, right there where it had to be. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Is that right? Yes. I was just glad he hadn't heard what I said about the phony temple. Tell me the moons of Jupiter. He knows all the moons of Jupiter. He recites them here in a little bit. Two. There's a bunch of new ones, aren't there? Two, but they're not new. New to us, said my father. You've turned pretty cheeky now. They're going under the knife. Under the knife, what an expression. He was not in bed tonight. His last night. He dies. That's it. That's all we get. We get that one line where she's looking at his house after, and we get his last night, and that tells us he passes away. He'd been attached from his apparatus, sitting in a chair. He's bare-legged, wearing a hospital dressing gown. You haven't named the old ones, I said. So he names those. The moons of Jupiter were the first heavenly bodies discovered with a telescope, he said. It wasn't Galileo who named them either. It was some German. He names them again. Yes. And then they talk about it. It's like this almost like frivolous stuff. There's this great Amy Hempel short story called "In the Cemetery Where Al Jolson's Buried." It might be available as a PDF. In fact, I might. I'll try to find it and attach it. And it's a similar situation where it's a friend and her friend. It's a friend who's visiting her friend who's in the hospital, who's terminal, who's dying of cancer, and she's not going to make it. And the whole story is filled with like these trivial facts about like celebrities and musicians and entertainers and so forth, and even just sort of scientific nuggets. And maybe 80-90% of them are fake, or like are made up, or wrong, or said wrong. But it's what they fill the time with in order to not talk about the inevitable. Something similar going on here with this conversation. At the same time, it's sort of celestial too, because they're talking about what's out there beyond the earth. It's very, very sweet. So that's not the last conversation they have, but it's the last conversation we see. And then we go back in time again, and to when she left the planetarium that afternoon, and she'd sit down, by the tomb there, the Chinese garden, and just watch people. And she thought maybe she saw Nicola at some point, but then the person didn't even look like Nicola. If I did see her, I might just sit and watch her decide. I felt like one of those people who floated up to the ceiling, enjoying a brief death. This is like the second epiphany, a relief while it lasts. My father had chosen, Nicola had chosen someday. So you have the father, choosing his own path. You have the daughter, same way, and you have this narrator who's understanding that sometime, probably soon, I would hear from her. But it came to the same thing. I meant to get up, go over to the tomb to look at the relief carvings, stone pictures, to go all the way around it. I always mean to look at them, and I never do. Not this time either. It's getting cold out. She goes back to the hospital. Love it. Love this story so much. Hope you all liked it too. I think it's a great story about relationships with parents. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be a dying parent or anything like that. It's just sort of understanding, what they think of when they think of you, and how you know, it's not all filtered from our perspective. They have their own, you know, autonomy as well. So anyway, I'm curious to hear what you think about it. For this upcoming week, we're going to look at Carried Away, and it's kind of long, so I don't know. Maybe it with Munro, because I want to give you a chance to sort of look around the book and find your own path with her, but possibly differently as well. But Carried Away for sure. And then after that, we're going to do Carver. He'll be the last author we look at. And I think what I'm going to do for Carver is there will be a paper for Munro. The paper for Munro, I'm going to ask that you analyze a story of hers we haven't read. Just short analysis. Not, you know, it doesn't have to be long. It just be one aspect of a story we haven't read. With Carver, I think your final paper will be tied directly into just maybe doing a few more forum posts as opposed to having to do a final paper, having him do a paper for Carver while you're also working on your final paper. So I'll definitely gonna go with that. So right now, just to let you know, there's 2 papers left for this class. This is the Munro response, and then there's going to be your final paper. There's also a lot of reading to do and commenting on the forum, but as long as you keep that up, you're good. And as far as I mentioned this earlier, as far as the stuff, the new grading goes with, everybody here is going to make an A or a B. So you're good there. You don't have to worry about C with whatever, they call it something different or whatnot. So don't worry about any of that. All right, hope you liked it. Bye-bye.